Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm sure some other folks will continue to join us as we get going, but it's great to have you all with us today. We're pleased to have you all here who are guests and members of our audience, and we're really excited to have the opportunity for all of you to interact with the really great group of panelists that we have here with you today on today's session and thinking about trying to support barriers to connectivity for students in rural communities. Right, let's go to the next slide, please, and tell you a little bit about our presenters. So my name is Matt Welch. I'm a technical assistance liaison with the T4 PA Center, and I'll be serving as a facilitator for this session. Our panel of experts are really the highlight of the session, and I'll tell you a little bit about them before we get started. First, Sarah Tretton is a senior policy advisor in the Office of Educational Technology at the U.S. Department of Education. There, she leads the department's broadband connectivity and digital inclusion work. Prior to working at the department, she's also been a community college librarian. She's been a teacher in residence at the Library of Congress, and she's also been a third grade teacher. Tom Rolfes is joining us from Nebraska. He is the State of Nebraska Chief Information Officer and the Nebraska Information Technology Commission, excuse me. In his role as the Education IT Manager, he coordinates telecommunications policy, infrastructure, and funding development for K-20 education in Nebraska. He's also the administrative lead for Network Nebraska, which I think Tom will tell us a little bit about. This is a self-funded statewide network consortium with just under 300 members, and that group I think will be of interest to some of our state level folks. Ron Cohn is the Network Information Service Director for Educational Service Unit 10 in Kearney, Nebraska. So he'll be providing us with an LEA perspective. And Carol Mosley is the Louisiana K-12 E-Rate Director for the Louisiana Department of Education. She works closely with school systems, district administrators, state agencies, and the private sector to implement programs to increase technology and broadband access for students across Louisiana. Many of you are familiar with E-Rate, so you may have questions for Carol about that. Her expertise is in procurement, contracting, telecommunication services, and E-Rate services. So we hope that if you have questions related to that, that you'll direct those to Carol. What are our goals for today's session? What we're really looking to do today is help everybody understand what are the challenges that students face with internet access, particularly students in rural communities. We're going to help you identify some short-term strategies for trying to increase internet access and connectivity for students in those communities. You'll have a chance to engage with experts in policy and practice, again, from the federal, state, and the local level in trying to enhance connectivity, especially for students in rural communities. And you'll be taking away some different resources and best practices, both in the form of what you hear from our four panelists, our four experts, as well as some other links and resources that we will have to share for you at the end of the session. How are we going to go about this? We'll get an overview of the needs at kind of a national level. Then we will hear from our expert panelists to hear a little bit about the state perspective in Louisiana and Nebraska, and then Ron will tell us a little bit about the local perspective in Kearney, Nebraska. And then we will have an opportunity for you all to engage in some discussion with our experts, and then we will share some resources and next steps, and you'll hear about some other upcoming events that are going on here at the center. To get us started, we wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what are the issues and challenges that you experience in your state or in your community, depending on where you're joining us from. So if you don't mind, we'd love to hear from you on this first polling question. We'll have a couple of these throughout our session today. Which of the following are significant connectivity issues in your state or in your community? Is it the access is not available? Is it not affordable? Is cellular service not available? Or are devices just not available? So we'll give you just a second to respond to that. We have about a little less than a minute for folks to respond to that. All right, we've got some answers to there coming in. Really interesting distribution to these so far. It'll take about 10 more seconds if you haven't responded. We'd love to hear from you on this first poll question. What are the significant connectivity issues in your state or community? Okay, why don't we close that up and we will see how we did. It seems like a lack of availability is the majority response, although interestingly enough, affordability and a lack of devices or a lack of sufficient devices are also important obstacles, and even cell service in some cases is hard to come by. So, but this is interesting for us to hear about, and this can be something that we think about as you direct questions to our different panelists. Okay, and speaking of our expert panelists, I want to have us turn it over to the first of our expert panelists, and that is Sarah Tretton, who is joining us from the U.S. Department of Education. Sarah.
Great, thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us here. I do want to thank the Title IV Part A Center for organizing the webinar and all of our other panelists for joining us to share their expertise. So I'm going to start the conversation with this kind of national level overview. I'm going to talk through a couple of data points that are specific to student and teacher home connectivity. I'm going to provide a really brief overview of some of the key challenges to connecting students at home and briefly discuss some of the solutions that we've seen districts and states implementing. And then finally, I'm going to provide a little bit of information on some of the forthcoming federal funding opportunities that specifically can be used to address home access for students. So I'm going to try to keep it brief so that our panelists who are at the state and district levels can provide their perspective of what these challenges and solutions really look like on the ground. All right, so first, some data to frame our conversation. Over the last year, I think all of us have become acutely aware of the digital divide facing our country. It's something that has been a challenge that many communities have faced, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the shift to doing school online and all other services online has really magnified the issues of internet access and affordability. A couple of the data points that I'm going to highlight come from a series of 3 reports that Common Sense Media published over the last year, and I would definitely recommend those for further reading. The reports take kind of an education-specific view of the issue, and they do a good job of kind of laying out both the data and also the why around closing the digital divide and why that's important for students and teachers. So this first slide really lays it out there, from a national perspective, the digital divide impacts nearly 30 million Americans across the United States who don't have access. Next slide. Specifically, when we're looking at K-12 public school students, the June report from Common Sense Media found that up to 16 million K-12 public school students live in households that either don't have an internet connection or don't have a device that's adequate for learning at home. And of that 15 to 16 million, 9 million of the students lack both the adequate internet access and the adequate device access. One more thing on this slide is the December report from Common Sense Media did highlight that some of the spending that's happened over the last year through the emergency stimulus programs and the work that states and districts have been doing to get devices and access like hotspots to students, has kind of temporarily lowered that number to about 12 million students that lack access. But I think the important thing to note is that a lot of these funding programs are temporary. And so it's an issue that we need to continue to try to tackle even once we move back to in-person learning. And so it's kind of temporarily, we've been able to tackle it in some regards, but it's something that we need to focus on with long-term solutions. Next slide. All right, so by geography, and this is kind of interesting, we know that the digital divide impacts, rural, urban, and suburban communities. but specifically students of color, students in rural or tribal communities, and students from low-income families see the greatest impact from the digital divide. Next slide. And another interesting data point that came out in one of the Common Sense reports is that they found that approximately 400,000 teachers lack adequate internet access to be able to teach remotely. And I think that was maybe one of the kind of hidden pieces to the digital divide. And it wasn't until we shifted to remote learning across most of our schools that the issues for teachers as well were being highlighted. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, from our perspective at the Department of Education, as students, return to school buildings and we move from pandemic response to recovery, we think it's really important to remain focused on addressing the digital divide for students because it was a problem for communities before the pandemic, and it will continue to be a challenge to students that lack access at home. Disparate connectivity results in consequences for educational opportunities and outcomes for students. There was a study that was done by the Quello Center at Michigan State University that looked at, I think it was a middle school student study, and they found that students that either don't have internet access at home or students who are dependent on a cell phone alone for access performed lower on a range of metrics, including digital skills, homework completion, and also grade point average. And families with low incomes tend to be more smartphone dependent and often lack connected devices like laptops or tablets, and even the assistive technology that's required for students with disabilities. This is just another example of how when we talk about access to internet and devices, it's also a question of the quality of the access, because having a smartphone is not going to give you the same kind of learning experience as having another connected device that's a little bit more robust. All right, so there are kind of three categories of challenges, and our first polling question was an interesting one because it highlights that in most cases for a family or a community, it's not just one of the challenges that's being faced. It's usually a combination of these three challenges around access, affordability, and adoption. So often, these are overlapping challenges, and they are challenges that impact rural communities and urban communities, but sometimes they just look slightly different. So just a really quick overview of the three challenges. With regards to access, as we know, folks on the call are specifically focused on their students in rural communities. Often the access challenge in rural communities is a result of, kind of distributed populations, really low population density, often some geographic challenges, which for internet service providers, they choose not to build and maintain really expensive fiber networks to these remote locations that have low population densities because it's a limited return on investment for those companies. The access challenge in urban communities looks a little bit different. There are documented examples where internet service providers maybe invest in building the fiber infrastructure in wealthier communities, but underinvest in building the broadband infrastructure in low-income communities, which results in low-income broadband users with more expensive and slower broadband access. And the access challenge is also going to be a challenge for families who are experiencing homelessness or who lack a permanent address and are highly mobile. So even in a community that otherwise might have great access, there also might be students who are facing access challenges because of that. And so our panelists will be able to dive into more of these great examples, but to address the access challenge, some of the things that we've seen, or one of the things that I'll highlight from the list is the wireless networks. And I think the chart might be a little mixed around, so I'll make sure that we get an accurate chart afterwards. But So one of the ways that schools are addressing the access challenge, especially in rural communities, is by building off-campus wireless networks that in some cases are school or district operated. In some cases, there are partnerships with other local businesses or local community organizations. We actually are going to be publishing in the next few weeks an off-campus wireless network brief that actually highlights 6 examples from school districts that have built their own networks to connect students at home. And actually Tom on the call from Nebraska, his work is highlighted in the brief, so he can provide more insight into what he's doing in Nebraska to address this challenge in their rural communities. On the affordability front, affordability is a significant driver of households without internet access or devices. The current population survey from 2017 found that 34% of households with children that are aged 3 to 18 and that don't have internet usually cite or have cited affordability as the major reason for not having that connection. And in terms of the solutions we've seen schools and districts and states using to address the affordability challenge, of course, the mobile hotspot lending has been something that's, I think, really a lot of folks have turned to in the last year. But one other solution that I wanted to highlight is the school-sponsored service. So this is another kind of solution that we've seen emerge in the last year, where school districts are kind of taking the lead role in working with service providers to kind of negotiate a low cost or a service plan for their students, and also taking the role of covering that cost of monthly service for students. So it kind of helps, I guess, with the negotiation piece of ensuring that that students are getting adequate or good service for what they need for learning. It also addresses the affordability piece by ensuring that month to month, the cost of that monthly service is going to be covered, at least for a temporary, period of time. And then the final kind of category of challenges, the adoption challenges, in communities where, there are options, there's access to options, and affordability might not be an issue that's on the table. Adoption challenges can be the result of folks with limited digital skills or language barriers, because kind of navigating the sign-up process and navigating understanding what plans might be available can be a challenge. In some cases, families might also be hesitant to share personal information that's required for sign up, like addresses, or in some cases, social security numbers. So these barriers in your communities might disproportionately impact English learners, children of immigrants without documentation, or again, students experiencing homelessness. So in terms of solutions, there are ways that schools and districts as kind of trusted entities in the community can help families navigate some of these sign-up processes and things. So things like creating an outreach team or partnering with other community-based organizations that have trust with communities to help families identify what plans might be available and to help navigate sign-up. We've seen states and districts launch tech support hotlines for families, especially right now, so that if something is going awry with the device in the middle of remote learning, there's a number to call and families can get help. And then another possible solution that we actually put forward as a strategy with the recently launched FCC Emergency Broadband Benefit Program is we've seen schools that host provider fairs. So if there are a couple of service providers that are available in the community that have low-cost internet plans, we've seen schools bring those providers in to have a booth or a table at a school event to share information about the service plan that they offer and to make that connection with the families. Next slide. All right, great. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to quickly highlight some of the federal funding that's available specifically to address the home access issues. So first, this slide is kind of a summary of the various emergency funding that has come out of the department over the last year. So there have been kind of three sets of funding that came out, starting with the CARES Act kind of last spring, the what we call the CARISA, which came out in December, and then the American Rescue Plan funds, which came out a little bit earlier this year. So across all three programs of these emergency funding programs, funds can be used for a wide range of needs, but that includes purchasing educational technology, including hardware, software, and connectivity. We will have some new FAQs coming out specifically about the American Rescue Plan ESSER funds, the elementary and secondary school funds, and the year funds. So those will be coming out soon, and in the resource list provided a link to kind of the landing page for our American Rescue Plan information. And so when those FAQs come out, they'll be posted there, and I'll also make sure to flag them for the Title IV Part A Center. Next slide. So this slide has a couple of other federal funding opportunities. These are all new programs within the last year that were also funded kind of under some of these emergency stimulus bills. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them, but the others on the page are programs that are worth looking into. So the very first one is the FCC's Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which actually launched on Wednesday, May 12th. And this is a temporary federal program, and the purpose is to help eligible households pay for internet service during the pandemic. So it's temporary. So the program will last either until the $3.2 billion runs out, or until 6 months after the end of the pandemic has been declared, and whichever comes first. Under the program, so the benefit is that eligible families will receive a monthly discount of up to $50 per month on their broadband service for eligible households. If they live on tribal lands, qualifying tribal lands, their discount will be up to $75 per month. And under this program, each participating household might also receive a one-time discount of $100 on a connected device like a laptop, a desktop, or a tablet computer. The one thing to flag is that not every participating provider is offering the connected device. And so, it won't necessarily be an option with every plan, but that is something that's allowed under the program. And kind of the reason that I'm highlighting this for you all is that households with a child who's been approved for benefits under the National School Lunch Program or the School Breakfast Program are eligible for this emergency broadband benefit. And that's for students who received the benefits in the 2019-2020 year or the 2020-21 year. And one other interesting point is that for students who attend a USDA community eligibility provision school, so in those designated schools, all students will be eligible for the EBB program. I do want to flag, because we are talking about rural communities, that there might be some communities that do not have any participating providers, or that do not have any existing infrastructure, internet access infrastructure. And so it is true that in those communities, like rural communities that might not have existing broadband infrastructure, they might be limited in their ability to take advantage of the program. The department has worked with the FCC over the last couple of months, and we've actually put together a series of FAQs and an outreach toolkit for schools and districts to help get the word out to families. And that link is provided in the resources. The other program that I really quickly want to highlight, and then because I think we're running a little over, is the Emergency Connectivity Fund, kind of the second piece on the list. The FCC came out this week and they adopted rules for this program, the Emergency Connectivity Fund. I've provided the link to the final rules in the resource list. And the reason I'm highlighting this program is that the program is for schools and libraries to purchase connected devices and broadband connections for students, school staff, or library patrons at locations other than the school or library. So this allows schools to purchase devices and connectivity for off-campus access for students. The program is also temporary. It's separate from the E-rate program, but it's going to be operated in with a lot of the same processes just for efficiency. And two things just to quickly highlight, there's a lot more in the final rules, but the first priority will be schools that are seeking funding for upcoming purchases of devices or connectivity. And then if there's funding that remains, then the FCC will consider providing funding for schools to be reimbursed for costs that they have already incurred, over the last year, as a lot of schools were purchasing devices and hotspots and things to get students connected. The other thing that I wanted to quickly highlight, there's a lot more detail in the final rule, is that in schools, so schools in areas where there is no internet service available, the FCC will allow support for dark fiber or construction of new networks, including the construction of self-provisioned networks. So I think this is especially important for rural communities where there's not an existing internet service provider. So, schools do have to demonstrate that there were no other commercially available internet access options that are there to support remote learning, but I did want to flag that since we are specifically talking about rural students. So again, the link to more information is in the resources. These other programs that are listed are also kind of emergency programs with funding to support broadband infrastructure and digital inclusion efforts. So I encourage you to take a look. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt and our panel.
Great. Sarah, thank you so much. It is really, really helpful to hear about all of those different initiatives that are going on right now, particularly those that are going on across federal agencies in response to the pandemic. We want to offer you the opportunity to participate in another chat question. Sarah did a nice job of laying out some of the challenges in terms of these kind of three categories or three buckets: access, affordability, and adoption. We want to ask you to share with us, what do you think is the biggest challenge in your immediate area? Is it access? Is it affordability? Or is it adoption? What are you seeing in your areas? Are there just no lines, no services? Is it the cost? Is it folks with access but not necessarily using it? We'll give you about another 10 seconds or so if you want to choose to respond to that. Okay. And it looks like access, again, is the primary challenge that folks are seeing there. So something, again, to think about in light of the resources that Sarah just mentioned to you at the federal level, as well as the different things that our expert panelists will mention to you in just a moment. So without any further ado, let's get to our second group of expert panelists who work on boosting rural connectivity in Louisiana and Nebraska, and that is Ron Cohn, Carol Mosley, and Tom Rolfes.
Good afternoon. This is Carol Mosley. I'm with the Louisiana Department of Education and our Office of Technology Services. over the past 19 years, I've worked with our school systems addressing their technology and broadband needs. Louisiana, in this past year, not only have we had the challenge of the pandemic, we've had a few hurricanes to visit, and also add additional challenges in our process of addressing what is really needed out there in the broadband space. And so we basically began approaching this by meeting directly with our 72 districts and our close to 200 charters in an individual basis to really understand what the needs of their community was and how we could really devise programs, solutions, and options that are going to meet what their students and their schools needed. This approach allowed us to kind of begin building a playbook and look at where they were and then what was really going to be successful in those areas. Just like our through these polls, we've seen availability of any kind of service in our rural areas was the largest challenge. And trying to meet with our providers, look at options for them to come in. We've started doing some very unique partnerships that we've worked out, as well as contracting to be able to engage them in a way that we hadn't in the past. So we have built groups and meetings between local mayors, using the school systems as our kind of primary point, and bringing in the business industry in the area. And sometimes that's simply just farms and different communities to look at, how can we service? We have had in one of our areas where we've had one of a major landowner offer to work with our school systems to provide land so we can build cellular towers and then bring that out to the community in order to get services, so that we're working with those schools to see what it is that's going to really be there. Then we have other communities that are using our schools as the anchors to build out first some fiber access to get to the major kind of, as we're going to say, our backbone highway, our mid-mile highway, and then using bunches of different techniques to get it further out to the home in those various areas. So we've had a lot of interesting pieces there. We've also partnered with different community centers and regional housing centers to set up community areas where we could broadcast Wi-Fi to those most neediest students who not only were they missing access, they could not afford that access even if we had placed it there. So we wanted to do these different pieces and really kind of look at what that meant, and had our community kind of buy into the work that we were doing so that we all felt that we were making progress. Additionally, we looked at creating contracts and mechanisms throughout our state that it would make it much more affordable for both our families, but also so that our schools and our students were able to be able to afford solutions that, generally schools did not pay for. So when they were putting in, if they were using cellular service or something like that, we combined that buying power across the state to lower that cost down to where it was truly affordable, and able to get plans, security, devices, and everything out there. So we kind of wanted it to be that, group approach in there. And so, that's the kind of way that we have been approaching it. We have been looking at it. We continue to work with our districts on it. We continue to come up with new ideas based on that. and try to take it as a state effort, not just a local effort in every step that we make in these processes. Because for our state to be successful, our schools have to be successful. And that's how we work through things there here in Louisiana. Tom, did you want to?
Thank you very much,
Okay,
Carol. We'd love to hear from some of our participants from Nebraska and hear how y'all are thinking about this at both the state and the local level there.
Very good. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Matt. So this is Tom Rolfus, working with the state office of the CIO. And in March of 2020, at the launch of the pandemic, we immediately, if state government can do this, we sprang into action. And we set up some multi-agency cooperation with the Nebraska Department of Ed, our intermediate service agencies, the Nebraska Library Commission, as well as Nebraska Educational Television. And we found that they all had a part to play. Even pre-pandemic, we had a jump start on these rural connectivity issues through the Governor's Rural Broadband Task Force that began meeting in 2018. Greta, if you'd go to the next slide. So don't mean this to be a Nebraska geography lesson, but the first thing we'd urge everyone to learn or know on the call from territories and states is to find out where your problems reside in terms of connectivity. If you're relying on some of the national surveys or FCC Form 477 data, it'll give you the scope of the problem, but it won't get you down to the address level. And Ron will have more information to share on that. But we knew we had a problem even pre-pandemic. And then once the pandemic struck, it was really a spotlight and exacerbating effect on our remote learners who did not have connectivity. Next slide.
And Tom, your audio is just a little bit quieter than it was before. I'm wondering if you might be able to do a little bit of an adjustment so we can hear you better. Unfortunately, now you're muted.
Is it a little bit better now?
Yes, I think so.
I'll just speak up if that's okay. So on affordability, and this will be true of any rural sparse state, we have areas of high population where there's great availability, but then you may run into some affordability issues. But in our rural areas, we have both. And you can see there in the left slide, when you get to rural sparse areas, if there is any internet available, families will find that they're paying many times more for similar connectivity than would happen in urban areas. That's not uncommon. On the availability side, we know that there's progress being made with state and federal grants, but some of those are going to be long haul, 10-year or more engagements to show progress. And what we're feeling with the homework gap is that we want to make immediate effect on our learners and staff without internet. So the first thing we wanted to do is find out where they were and then take steps in order to get them connected. Sarah mentioned one of the highlight projects in Nebraska is our tribal private LTE project. We had 5 public school districts on tribal lands partner with the Nebraska Indian Community College and actually envisioned, deployed, purchased equipment to bring internet to student homes who had 0 megabits previously. And they did that through a combination of different federal funding, both tribal and with ESSER funding in order to make that happen. And that project went live in September 2020 And it was amazing that they were able to do that themselves with only 6 months. If you turn to the next slide, our third issue is really adoption. So could you bring affordable internet to every household and still may they not connect? Yes, that's a possibility, but we find it in a very, very small minority of cases. These other boxes on this slide show from our homework app survey of teachers in July of 2019, and myself as a former educator, I was struck by our teacher responses, and we had almost 7,000, a 32% response rate in July of 2019. Were telling us that because of the internet lack in rural areas, they had already begun to make adjustments in their classroom decision making such that they would not assign homework and they would keep the instructional environment to daytime only. And I was flabbergasted at the dozens, hundreds of comments we had of teachers who said they had simply stopped assigning homework because they could not control the home environment or whether or not they had internet. So that's a quick intro on the state level. We're working vertically, obviously with school districts and our ESUs, and very closely with Nebraska Department of Ed to begin to show progress in this area. So back to Matt, unless you're going to queue up Ron.
Thank you, Tom. And Ron, we'd love to hear a bit from you about what you're working on at the local level, particularly as it relates to funding, where it comes from, how you use it, and other efforts that you're making at the local level to increase connectivity for students.
Well, thank you. Appreciate being a part of this today. My work at ESU 10 in South Central Nebraska, we have 33 public districts, 11 private schools that we can work with as well. And so I get a little smattering of information from them. And as all of us have wrestled with, there's a lot of federal funds coming at us, and how can we qualify for those? And so I think that's been the target of most of the funding, although E-rate has been something that's been around for a long time. And my team assists our districts with those applications, validating, what it is that they might want to pursue. And being a member of Network Nebraska, we rely on them for a lot of internet access, and they do some filing for us as well. But in terms of some of the local things that we're working on, mapping, as Tom referred to, has become a critical issue, in that if you don't know which students don't have internet, you may not be addressing the problem properly. And one of the superintendents I spoke with recently indicated they had a big problem in their area, and it's not too far from where I work. And so I thought it might be a good location to create a pilot project. But after analyzing some of the data that we used, the 6 homes that were identified were all within the city limits, and there are multiple providers within the city limits. And so just knowing what the data really shows changed the direction of that potential pilot project, and we didn't feel like it was the best use case for the funds. And so that's one of the things that I find being critical for that. I know within some of the other comments that others have made in mentioning pilot projects, one of my fears is that we begin supporting networks, and though I have a team of technical support folks, the mission of schools is to educate students. And so if they're beginning to become providers of backbones and services out to homes, who is going to service those? So it's great to have a number to call when the student has an issue with internet and they need support. That has typically not been a focal point of many of my districts, at least. And yet, so a little bit of concern with that. And so partnerships become the key area that we really try to promote, at least, and that's my opinion primarily, is if we can partner with a provider that's already in the area, that is something that they would do possibly better than we would, just because it's their mission and not ours. And yet we really want to see those students successful, whether they're doing homework at home or teaching from home. So those are a couple thoughts that I have. I'll throw it back to you, Matt.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. It's helpful to hear what you're working on there. In the time we have, we would love to hear a bit from our audience members, or actually, pardon me, before we do that, we did have one final question that we wanted to ask of all of you. And it really is, if we could hear a bit about what solutions you all have tried in the States as you think about how you have tried to increase connectivity for students in rural communities. What all have you done, those of you who are members of our audience who are joining today?
And don't be shy.
While folks are thinking about maybe ideas that they'd like to share, Carol, Ron, and Tom, wondering if you all have thought about short-term and long-term solutions to trying to increase connectivity for students in rural communities. Are there things that you have tried to do in the more immediate term in terms of responding to the needs of the pandemic, but also maybe more long-term plans that you have to support, whether it's devices, technology, infrastructure, and other things in rural communities? How are you thinking about that right now?
I definitely think that we think that way a lot. Tom referenced a project, Carol as well. I think in our area, the fastest thing to address it would be some type of private wireless that the school would put up. But really, I look back to those partnerships if there's providers in the area. The other thing that I recognize, and I think you might see this on slide 27, is trying to figure out a way to incentivize maybe some local providers to expand their network. There are other federal funds and programs out there, such as the RDOF and the CAF funds, that providers leverage to try to build their networks. And if you can decide or find out where they are going and say, can we incentivize you to do this area next? Or can we incentivize you somehow with a partnership to expand beyond just that areas? They have requirements within those programs, but could they fill in the gap that they had not won within those auctions potentially? And that could be maybe a longer term, not necessarily a fast one, but maybe that's more sustainable.
Yeah. And one of the things that we even suggested as our, because most districts are using E-rate to pay their funds. So a criteria that we have talked with our schools about is adding the criteria of how is the providers that are bidding on the school service servicing your community, and then adding services and expanding services out from your school to connect those homes. So as they're reviewing and picking providers, because a lot of these rural areas, the school is the biggest purchaser of internet and internet services. So if they're coming in, we're telling them, yes, that's great. You're going to get more points and you're going to more likely win one of our school bids if you're going to service the homes and go out to that community, and how many community and student members are you going to be connecting. So it incentivizes them to be more than just coming in, connecting our schools, and moving on.
Is that like a formal condition, Carol, that you would put on the awarding of the bid?
Yep, they get more points for having community access versus just servicing us.
Yeah, as opposed to just running one line to the school.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Very interesting. Ron used the term incentivize, and Carol, you've talked a little bit about how you do that at the state level in Louisiana. Tom, any other thoughts on roles that state level entities could play, whether it's state government, or I know you're also a member of this kind of interesting consortium that you all have going in Nebraska. Any other ways that you think that at the state level they could support schools or private entities and partnerships between the same and getting connectivity to increase?
Yep. And can you hear me okay now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Network Nebraska is a statewide network of all school districts in the state. Right now we're enabling or empowering or counseling and guiding our districts to make wise decisions. But at the beginning and the end of the day, they're using our internet. So first of all, we make it okay for them to share beyond their school district boundaries and do an appropriate cost allocation related to E-rate. If we look to our neighbors to Utah, their statewide network has taken a much more active role in the self-deployment from the district out to the home. And we're a little bit envious of that. And they have the personnel and use their ESSER funding to make that happen across multiple districts in a coordinated fashion. And every one of the private LTE installs that go in must have what's called an EPC, Evolved Packet Core, to handle the bidirectional calls from student devices. So that statewide network opted to put those very expensive appliances within their own network. In Nebraska, we're not quite to that critical mass yet, but we're prepared to do that as more of our districts adopt self-deployment measures. And then Ron mentioned the partnerships. We have a wireless provider in Nebraska, new to the state, very interested in partnering with districts half and half on new towers, their wireless towers that would be placed on school district property.
Interesting. Do those towers, Tom, in Nebraska generate any revenue for the LEAs?
They could, or it may be an in-kind complementary project.
Yeah.
So a district may be interested in getting Wi-Fi to their whole campus, connecting with their bus system by radio. The towers are 100 to 150 feet monopoles, cost $30,000. But what the providers find of interest is that they know that there's already fiber to the district,
right,
that can be bifurcated for double purposes. So
that's really interesting.
yes.
Raquel, could we go to slide 34, please? We are going to start wrapping up this session, but I want to extend my thanks to Sarah and to Ron and Carol and Tom for joining us today and sharing their experience and their expertise and hearing about how they think of these questions at both the state and the federal and the local level. There's a number of different resources that are available to you, and we've got some links here in the slides. As always, these slides are going to be available through the Title IV Part A Center's website and portal, but you'll also be able to find a recording of this session through the U.S. Department of Education's YouTube channel, so that will be available to them. And so you'll have a chance to view these different links and these different federal level resources there. I want to again say really a thank you to Sarah from the U.S. Department of Education, Tom from Nebraska, Ron Cohn from Kearney, Nebraska, and Carol from Louisiana. Thank you very much to the four of you for coming and sharing your experience and your expertise. We very much appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who came today as our guests to hear from these folks. Really appreciate it.